Believing that the ancient woods offer you solace is the most dangerous lie you can tell yourself. You flee the cold concrete of your cities, the hum of dead electricity, seeking a connection to something primal, something real. You pack your tents and your supplies, imagining a gentle communion with nature, a return to innocence under a blanket of silent stars. But you have forgotten that innocence was bled out of these forests centuries ago. The soil you walk on is not just earth, it is a sponge, saturated with the cold ashes of forgotten fires, the dried blood of rituals you cannot comprehend, and the silent, screaming memories of those who made the same mistake as you. They came seeking peace, and found only a silence that watches and waits and consumes. I have seen it in the reflections of a cracked mirror, in the patterns of crows scattering against a bruised twilight sky. I saw a vision of 1,000 campfires, each one a tiny flickering pocket of warmth in an ocean of absolute patient darkness. And around each fire, I saw the hopeful faces of men and women, blind to the shadows that danced just beyond the light's edge. These were not the shadows of trees. They were distorted, elongated, things with too many joints and a hunger that chills the bone. They are the true inhabitants, the ancient landlords of the forest. You are not a guest in their home. You are an invitation, a fleeting warmth they are drawn to, a soft meal before the long, cold night returns. Listen closely. Let my voice be the whisper that crawls up your spine in the dead of night. The stories I am about to share are not mere fiction spun for your entertainment. They are echoes, fragments of truth that have clawed their way out of the suffocating soil and into the world of the living. They are the final testaments of souls who learned too late that the rustling in the leaves is not always the wind, and the eyes you feel on your back do not always belong to a forest creature. This is a warning, etched in the language of fear and delivered from beyond the veil. What you are about to hear is a map of places you should never go, and a litany of names you should never ever whisper in the dark. Our first echo comes from a place that was once called Whisper Creek by the hopeful fools who tried to map it. Now, it has no name. It is simply a scar on the land, a place the animals avoid and the birds refuse to sing. A young couple, Mark and Sarah, sought it out. They craved isolation, a place untouched by the modern world, a place to lose themselves in each other. They found the isolation they were looking for, but they were not alone. Their first night was textbook perfection. A roaring fire, the taste of cheap wine, the Milky Way a smear of divine light above them. They spoke of their future, of children, of a life together. Their voices small and fragile against the vast, indifferent wilderness. Their laughter was a profanity in that sacred silence. The forest listened to their plans with a cold, ancient amusement. It had heard such promises before, swallowed them whole, and left no trace. As their fire began to die, casting long, skeletal shadows that seemed to claw at their tent, Sarah felt the first prickle of unease. A feeling not of being watched by an animal, but of being observed by something with an intelligence that was both alien and deeply, personally malevolent. She dismissed it as paranoia, the city girl's nerves. Mark, emboldened by wine and ego, assured her they were safe. Safety is a word that has no meaning in a place that has been hungry for 1,000 years. It is a fragile shield of ego that shatters at the first touch of true reality. The sound that woke them was not a twig snapping. It was the deliberate, wet sound of something heavy being dragged through the damp leaves. It was slow, rhythmic, and it was circling their tent. Not approaching, not retreating, just circling. A predator toying with its meal. Mark, his bravado evaporated, reached for the heavy flashlight, his hand trembling. The thin nylon of the tent was no longer a shelter. It was a burial shroud, a translucent membrane between their warm breathing lives and the cold, patient thing outside. Every rasp of leaves, Every wet, dragging sound was a syllable in a language they were never meant to understand. The language of the end. Do you feel this dark message was meant for you? Let the echoes manifest in the space below. Sarah began to weep, not loudly, but with the silent, choked sobs of utter despair. The circling stopped. For a moment, a terrifying moment, there was absolute silence. Not the gentle silence of the night, but a dead, pressurized void, as if all the air had been sucked out of the world. And then, a whisper. It was not human. It slid against the canvas of the tent, a dry, sibilant sound like snakeskin over dry bone. It whispered Sarah's name, not as Mark said it, with love and familiarity, but as a butcher would read a label, an identification of a piece of meat. Her name, spoken by a throat that had never known air, echoed in the crushing emptiness. The paralysis of fear is a real and terrible cage. Mark could not move, could not breathe. His mind, a fortress of modern logic, had crumbled into dust. All he could do was stare at the tent wall, where a shadow was beginning to press inward. It was not the shape of a man, or a bear, or anything he could name. It was a long, thin silhouette, a distortion of anatomy that seemed to defy the laws of physics. The fabric of the tent stretched, groaned under the pressure of that unholy touch. He saw the shape of a long, three-jointed finger trace the curve of the tent, right where Sarah's head lay on her pillow. The whisper came again, this time thick with a sound like wet gravel. Mine. What happened next was not a flurry of violence. It was a quiet, methodical dismantling of reality. The zipper on the tent began to move, not from the inside, but from the outside. It slid upward slowly, with a metallic shriek that was louder than any scream. Mark finally found his voice, a pathetic, strangled cry, as he fumbled for the hunting knife he'd brought for protection. Protection against what? A bad dream, an impossible truth. The flap of the tent peeled open, and the cold, damp air of the forest flooded in, carrying with it a smell of rich soil, deep decay, and something else, something metallic and sweet. The smell of old, dried blood. They were not greeted by a monster of teeth and claws. In the darkness of the tent's opening stood a figure that was only vaguely humanoid, impossibly tall and thin, its limbs bent at angles that were entirely wrong. It didn't have eyes, but they could feel its gaze, a psychic weight that crushed the very air they breathed. It did not move. It simply stood there, a tear in the fabric of the world, a living, breathing blasphemy. And then, it raised one of its long, spindly arms and pointed a finger, not at Mark, who held the useless knife, but directly at Sarah. It did not need to speak again. The intention was as clear as a funeral bell. It had come for her. It had chosen. The official report, filed by a shell-shocked sheriff a week later, stated that Mark was found wandering miles away, catatonic and suffering from severe dehydration and exposure. His hair had turned bone white. He could only repeat a single phrase over and over again. It whispered her name. Of Sarah, they found nothing. Not a footprint, not a torn piece of clothing, not a single drop of blood. It was as if she had simply evaporated from existence. The campsite was pristine, the tent zipped shut, the campfire a circle of cold ashes, but the ground around the tent was covered in a single, unbroken, circling track, a deep, wet furrow in the earth, as if something impossibly heavy had been dragged around it, again and again and again. This is the nature of the pact you make when you step into the woods. You trade the illusion of civilized safety for the raw, unfiltered truth of the universe, that you are small, fragile, and utterly inconsequential. The ancient things that dwell in the deep places do not hate you. They do not love you. You are simply a resource, a flicker of warmth, a brief, savory meal. a name to be whispered on the wind before you are unmade. Every soul that joins feeds the voice that whispers from the darkness. It gives these shadows form and purpose, and allows these warnings to reach those who still have time to listen. Now, let the cold dread of Sarah's silent departure settle deep within you. Feel it crystallize in your marrow, because another echo is rising, carried on the scent of pine and old rot. This is not a story of a couple, but of a lone man. A man who believed himself to be a master of the wilderness. A park ranger named Alistair Finch. He was a man of logic, of science. He knew every plant, every animal, every trail in the sprawling national park that was his kingdom. He believed that everything had an explanation, a rational cause and effect. The forest, however, had other ideas. It intended to teach him a final, brutal lesson in humility. Alistair was on a routine multi-day patrol in the park's most remote sector, a place known as the Devil's Jaw for its jagged, unforgiving terrain. He was checking for illegal snares and signs of poachers. For the first 2 days, everything was as it should be. The familiar symphony of the woods was his companion. But on the third evening, as he made camp by a still, black lake, the symphony stopped. Not gradually, but all at once. The chirping of crickets, the call of the owls, the rustle of small creatures in the undergrowth, all of it vanished, replaced by a profound and unnatural silence, the kind of silence that precedes an earthquake or a hurricane. A silence that is not empty, but full of dreadful anticipation. He sat by his small fire, a seasoned veteran of the woods, yet for the first time in his 20-year career, he felt a sliver of pure, primal fear. He tried to rationalize it. A large predator nearby, perhaps a mountain lion, could silence the smaller animals. But this was different. The very air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the silence had a physical weight. He scanned the tree line with his powerful flashlight, but the beam seemed to be swallowed by the darkness, unable to penetrate more than a few feet. It was like pointing a light into a wall of black velvet. The forest was actively resisting his attempts to see it. It was hiding something, or something was hiding it. The first sound, when it came, was a mockery of the silence it shattered. It was a soft, melodic humming. It seemed to come from all directions at once. A beautiful, ethereal tune that was completely at odds with the crushing dread in the air. Alistair was a practical man. He thought perhaps a lost hiker, disoriented, maybe even delirious. He cupped his hands around his mouth and called out, his voice sounding thin and weak in the oppressive quiet. "Hello? Is anyone out there? This is Park Ranger Finch." The humming stopped. Again the world plunged into that dead, waiting silence. He waited, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The response, when it came, was not a human voice. From the dark surface of the lake, a single bubble rose and popped, then another, and another. Soon, the entire surface of the black water was roiling, not with the violence of a boiling pot, but with a slow, thick, oily disturbance. A foul stench began to rise from the water, the smell of stagnant mud, and something else, something like rotting meat, left too long in the sun. Alistair stumbled back, his hand reaching for the flare gun on his hip. He was no longer thinking about lost hikers. His experienced mind was screaming at him, a single primal command. But his feet were rooted to the spot, held fast by a terrible, morbid curiosity. He had to see. He had to know. From the center of the churning lake, a pale, white form began to rise. It was not a log, not an animal. It was smooth and long, and sickeningly white in the moonlight. It looked like a finger, a colossal, bone-white finger, emerging from the depths. Its nail cracked and yellowed like ancient parchment. Then another rose beside it, and another, until a whole colossal hand had breached the surface of the lake. It was a hand that could have crushed his entire camp with a single clench of its fist. It lay there on the surface of the water, palm up, fingers slightly curled, as if waiting for something to be placed in it. The humming started again, this time seeming to emanate from the hand itself, a siren song of decay. Alistair's scientific mind fought for an explanation. A fungal growth, a strange geological formation, a hallucination brought on by tainted water. But his soul knew the truth. This was ancient. This was wrong. This was a piece of something that should have remained buried, sleeping in the cold, dark mud for eternity. He finally broke his paralysis, turning to scramble for his pack, for his radio, for anything that connected him to the sane, rational world he had always known. But as he turned, he saw that the humming had drawn something else out of the woods. Standing at the edge of his camp, just where the firelight died, were figures, dozens of them. They were pale and gaunt, their eyes wide and completely black, reflecting no light. They wore the tattered remnants of clothing from different eras, faded flannel shirts, old-fashioned hiking boots, even the buckskin of a long-dead trapper. They were the lost hikers, the vanished tourists, the forgotten souls the park had claimed over the decades. And they were all staring at him, not with malice, but with a horrifying, empty hunger. They began to move toward him, not walking, but gliding over the ground, their feet making no sound. They were moving toward the hand in the lake, and he was in their path. The humming grew louder, a chorus of decay calling its children home. Alistair's last radio transmission was a garbled, frantic scream, cut short by a wet, tearing sound. When the search party found his campsite 2 days later, it was eerily similar to the one at Whisper Creek. The fire was cold ashes. His pack and equipment were untouched, but there was no sign of Alistair Finch. The only thing out of place was a series of deep, dragging marks, leading from the edge of the woods to the shore of the Black Lake. And on the surface of the still water, floating gently, was a single worn park ranger's hat. The lake itself was silent, its surface as smooth and dark as a cracked mirror reflecting an empty sky. The wilderness does not need claws or teeth to be a monster. Sometimes, its weapon is beauty, a mesmerizing song, a strange light in the sky, a phenomenon that defies explanation. It baits the hook of your curiosity and reels you into a place from which there is no return. It dismantles your understanding of the world, brick by brick, until you are left naked and screaming in the face of an impossible truth. Alistair Finch spent his life studying the rules of nature, only to be unmade by something that follows no rules at all. His knowledge was a cage, and the truth was the key that unlocked it, only to release him into a far, far greater prison. Think of these places, these scars on the map, Whisper Creek, the Devil's Jaw. They are not just locations, they are wounds, wounds in the fabric of reality where the veil between our world and something else has worn thin. When you enter these places, you are crossing a threshold. You are stepping out of the story of humanity and into a much older, darker narrative. A narrative in which you are not the hero, but merely a footnote, a brief splash of color before the page is turned, and you are forgotten forever. The creaking doors of perception are everywhere in the woods. You just need to know where to push. Let us now turn our gaze from the water to the trees themselves, the ancient sentinels that have witnessed more than any human history has ever recorded. Our next echo is a strange one. It isn't about a monster or a ghost in the traditional sense. It's about the forest itself, waking up. It comes from the testimony of a group of 4 friends, college students on a spring break camping trip. They were not seasoned outdoorsmen. They were city kids, looking for a cheap thrill, an escape from their studies. They chose a patch of woods known for its unusually dense, old-growth trees, a place the locals called the Gray Cathedral. Their first day was filled with a foolish, youthful arrogance. They played loud music on a portable speaker. They left a trail of litter. They carved their initials into the ancient bark of a towering redwood. They treated the forest not as a living entity, but as a backdrop for their social media posts. They were deaf to the whispers of the place, blind to the omens that were all around them. The way the birds would fall silent whenever their music played. The way the squirrels would freeze mid-scamper, watching them with an unnerving stillness. The way the shadows of the great trees seemed to lean in, to listen to their pointless, profane conversations. The first sign that something was truly wrong came after nightfall. They had built a massive, roaring bonfire, a beacon of their ignorance in the heart of the ancient wood. As they sat around it, laughing and drinking, one of them, a young man named Leo, noticed something odd. The trees surrounding their campsite seemed closer than they had been when they first set up their tents. He mentioned it to his friends, who laughed it off. "You're drunk, man," they told him. He tried to dismiss it, but the feeling lingered, a cold knot in his stomach. He could have sworn the massive oak to the north was now blocking a patch of stars he had been looking at just an hour before. Later that night, long after the others had passed out in their tents, Leo was woken by a sound. It was a low, deep groaning, like the hull of a great ship straining against a storm. It was followed by a slow, grinding, cement-like noise. He cautiously unzipped his tent and peered out. The bonfire had burned down to glowing embers, casting a weak, hellish light on the scene, and what he saw made his blood turn to ice. The trees were moving. It was almost imperceptible, a slow, patient, deliberate shifting. The great oak was now several feet closer to their camp. A cluster of pines to the east had rearranged themselves, forming a dense, impenetrable wall. The forest was closing in. He tried to scream, to wake his friends, but the sound was trapped in his throat, a strangled gasp of pure terror. This wasn't a hallucination. This was a geological, botanical impossibility happening right before his eyes. The ground beneath him seemed to vibrate with a low, powerful thrumming, the sound of a million roots shifting in the earth. The forest was not a collection of individual trees. It was a single, colossal organism, and it had been awakened by their disrespect. It was now reconfiguring itself, sealing them in, turning their pleasant little clearing into a cage from which there would be no escape. The path they had walked in on was gone, swallowed by a newly formed thicket of thorny bushes. The gray cathedral was no longer a place of silent majesty. It was a prison, and the trees were the bars. The next morning, the others woke to Leo's frantic, incoherent babbling. They didn't believe him until they saw it for themselves. The clearing was noticeably smaller. The trees formed a perfect, unbroken circle around them, their branches interlocking overhead, blotting out the sun and casting the camp into a perpetual, gloomy twilight. Panic set in. They tried to find the trail, but there was no way out. Every direction they turned, they were met with a wall of wood and leaves that had not been there the day before. The forest had become a labyrinth of its own design. Their phones, of course, had no signal. Their shouting was absorbed by the thick, heavy leaves, their voices dying a few feet from their mouths. The forest seemed to actively dampen sound, isolating them in a bubble of their own mounting hysteria. For 2 days they were trapped. Their food ran out. Their water was low. Their arrogant bravado dissolved into desperate, weeping prayers. The trees just watched, silent and unmoving now, their work complete. They seemed to radiate a cold, ancient satisfaction. A lesson was being taught. A debt was being collected for the scars carved into their bark, for the profane noise that had disturbed their long slumber. On the third day, a strange, sweet-smelling sap began to drip from the branches of the trees overhead. It was thick and golden, like honey. Driven by thirst and starvation, one of the friends, a girl named Maya, licked some of it from a leaf. "It was delicious," she said. The others, despite Leo's warnings, followed her lead. They drank the sap greedily. It sated their hunger and quenched their thirst, and it filled them with a strange, blissful euphoria. They laughed and danced, their fear forgotten, their minds clouded by the sweet, intoxicating nectar of the ancient wood. Leo alone refused to partake, his fear of the trees overriding even his desperate hunger. He watched in horror as his friend's euphoria slowly transformed into a placid, empty-eyed trance. They stopped talking. They simply stood, faces upturned to the canopy, as the golden sap dripped onto their skin, into their open mouths. Their skin began to take on a pale, greenish hue. Their movements became slow, stiff, wooden. They were being changed, assimilated, absorbed. The forest was not just imprisoning them, it was claiming them. It was turning them into part of itself. Leo, the sole witness to this slow botanical horror, could do nothing but watch as his friends became living statues, silent, smiling effigies in the heart of their green prison. The last thing Leo remembered before he finally succumbed to madness was the sight of a thin, green vine snaking out from the trunk of the great oak, wrapping itself gently around Maya's unmoving ankle. It was not a violent act. It was possessive, a final claim. He was found a month later by a logging crew, miles from where the campsite was supposed to be. He was emaciated, his mind shattered beyond repair. Of his 3 friends and their equipment, no trace was ever found. The area known as the Grey Cathedral is now closed to the public, fenced off due to geological instability. The truth is far more disturbing. The cathedral is still there, and it is waiting for new worshippers. Do you feel this dark message was meant for you? Let the echoes manifest in the space below. The greatest arrogance of humanity is the belief that we are the masters of this world, that nature is something to be tamed, to be used, to be catalogued. We are but a brief, noisy infestation. The true powers of this earth are ancient, slow, possess a patience that we cannot even begin to comprehend. They slumber, and for that we should be grateful. But sometimes we are foolish enough to disturb their sleep. And when an ancient thing awakens, it is often very, very hungry. The story of the Grey Cathedral is not a ghost story. It is a story of trespassing, of a price paid in flesh and sanity for a moment of youthful ignorance. Now, let the image of those human-shaped trees fade. Let the memory of that sweet golden sap curdle in your stomach. We must move on, for the whispers from the darkness are relentless. This next account is different. It is not an echo from a survivor. It is a final testament, a message in a bottle cast into an ocean of silence. It comes from a cracked memory card found inside a shattered camera at the bottom of a ravine. It is the last footage shot by a paranormal investigation team, a trio of hopeful fame seekers who called themselves Specter trackers. They went looking for ghosts, and found something that makes a simple haunting seem like a child's bedtime story. The team, Jake the leader, Chloe the tech expert, and Ben the cameraman, were investigating the infamous Black Creek Mine, an abandoned coal mine deep in the mountains, with a dark history of cave-ins, strange disappearances, and local legends of tunnel folk. Their plan was to camp near the mine's entrance for a night, collecting atmospheric data before venturing inside the next day. They were cavalier, treating the expedition as a thrilling game. Their early footage is full of jokes, boasts, and a complete lack of respect for the heavy, oppressive energy of the place. They were broadcasting their presence, ringing a dinner bell for whatever lurked in the deep dark. Their first night of camping was uneventful, almost disappointingly so. Their EMF meters were silent, their thermal cameras showed nothing but cooling rocks, and the occasional night animal. Jake, frustrated, decided they needed to provoke a reaction. Against Chloe's warnings, he stood before the boarded-up entrance of the mine and began to taunt it. He yelled challenges into the darkness, called out the names of miners who had died there, and demanded that whatever was inside show itself. Then kept the camera rolling, capturing Jake's arrogant display. It was a performance for a future audience, an act of pure hubris that would seal all of their fates. The response was not immediate. It was subtle. As Jake finished his tirade, the temperature plummeted, not by a few degrees, but by at least 30. Their breath plumed in the air, frost forming on their equipment. Then, a low, guttural sound echoed from deep within the mine, a sound that was not a voice, not an animal, but more like the shifting of a mountain's very bones. The boards over the mine entrance began to vibrate, rattling in their frames. A fine black dust, coal dust, began to pour out from the cracks, as if the mine itself was exhaling a long-held foul breath. Chloe's EMF meter screamed, the needle redlining as the energy spiked to impossible levels. Even Jake was shaken. They retreated to their campfire, the mood now somber and laced with genuine fear. The footage shows them huddled together, their faces pale in the firelight, constantly glancing back towards the groaning, vibrating mine entrance. The woods around them had fallen into that same dead, unnatural silence we have heard of before. But this silence was punctuated by a new sound, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the rocks all around them, a call and response, a tapping from one boulder, answered by a tapping from another. It was a code, a communication. They were surrounded by things they could not see, things that were talking about them. The final segment of the footage is almost unwatchable. The camera is shaking violently, then breathing in ragged, terrified gasps. The tapping has grown louder, closer. Figures can be seen at the very edge of the camera's light, pale, naked things, their bodies long and emaciated, their limbs moving with a spidery, unsettling grace. They were not ghosts. They were flesh. Their skin was the color of bleached bone, their eyes huge, black, and completely devoid of pupils. They moved with a speed that was impossible, skittering over rocks and up the trunks of trees, their long, claw-like fingers digging into the bark. They were the tunnel folk, and they had come out of the mine to greet their visitors. The last clear image is of Jake, standing with a useless camp axe in his hand, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He swings the axe at a pale shape that lunges from the darkness. The camera then falls to the ground, but the audio continues. It records the sounds of screaming, of wet, tearing noises, and the triumphant chittering clicks of the creatures. It records Chloe's voice, not screaming, but repeating a single broken phrase. "They're not dead, they're not dead," and then a final sickening crunch, followed by silence. The memory card recorded another 10 minutes of darkness before the camera's battery finally died. When you seek out the darkness, you must be prepared for the darkness to seek you out in return. The Specter trackers went looking for a story, for a thrill, for a few thousand more subscribers on their channel. They found a truth so horrifying it consumed them. They learned that not all legends are just stories. Some are warnings. Some are desperate attempts by those who know to keep the foolish and the arrogant away from places where the old rules of life and death no longer apply. The things in the Black Creek mine were not ghosts of the dead miners. They were what the miners had become, twisted by the deep earth and a hunger that light could never satisfy. Every soul that joins feeds the voice that whispers from the darkness. Your attention gives these horrors strength. Let the chittering echoes of the tunnel folk fade from your ears. Let the image of that fallen camera be burned into your mind. There are mysteries in this world that are not meant to be solved. There are doors that are meant to remain locked, sealed, not with wood and iron, but with fear and forgetting. To knock on such a door is to invite the ruin that waits behind it. But the foolishness of man is boundless, and so the whispers must continue. The warnings must be given, even if they fall on deaf ears. Our next story is a descent, not into a mine, but into a different kind of darkness. The darkness of a place that is fundamentally, architecturally wrong. It comes from the fragmented journal of a hiker named Elias Vance, a man who prided himself on going off trail, on finding the places no one else had seen. He was exploring a vast remote wilderness in the Pacific Northwest, a place of ancient forests and perpetual rain. In his journal, he described stumbling upon a clearing he had never seen on any map. In the center of the clearing stood a single immense structure. It was not a cabin, not a lodge. It was a staircase, a perfectly constructed, ornate wooden staircase, rising up into the sky, leading to absolutely nowhere. It was just there, a piece of impossible architecture in the middle of an untamed wilderness. Elias was, by his own account, mesmerized. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the wood a dark, polished ebony he didn't recognize. There were no supports, no visible signs of construction. It seemed to have grown from the earth itself. His rational mind screamed that it was a prank, an art installation, a forgotten film set. But his intuition, the part of him that was truly connected to the wild, knew this was something else. It felt ancient, sacred, and deeply, profoundly dangerous. The air around it was still and cold, and the forest was silent. Nothing grew at the base of the stairs. The soil in a perfect circle around it was barren and black. He spent the rest of an entire day just observing it from a distance, sketching it in his journal, noting the strange spiraling carvings on the banister that seemed to shift and writhe when he wasn't looking directly at them. He made camp that night at the edge of the clearing, unable to bring himself to leave. He wrote about a strange, compelling pull the staircase exerted, a siren's call to his curiosity. He felt an overwhelming urge to climb it, to see where it went, even though his eyes told him it went nowhere. He wrote, "It feels like a question that demands an answer, and I am afraid of what that answer might be." That night, he was plagued by nightmares. He dreamed he was climbing the stairs, and with each step, the world behind him grew darker, more distorted. His friends' faces melted like wax. His memories turned to ash. He was climbing away from everything he had ever known. He awoke in a cold sweat, the dream still clinging to him like a shroud. The staircase stood in the pre-dawn light, seeming to mock him with its silent, impossible presence. Against his better judgment, against the screaming protests of his own survival instinct, he decided he had to touch it, just to see if it was real. As his hand made contact with the cold, smooth wood of the banister, a jolt went through him, like a powerful static shock. His journal entry describing this moment is shaky, almost illegible. He writes of a flood of images, of sounds, of sensations that poured into his mind. He saw visions of other worlds, of alien skies, of cities built from light and shadow. He heard a chorus of voices whispering in a language of clicks and chimes. He felt the crushing loneliness of a billion empty years. The staircase was not just wood. It was a conduit, a doorway, an antenna tuned to a frequency that the human mind was not meant to receive. He stumbled back, his nose bleeding, his mind reeling from the psychic assault. He knew then that he had to leave, that he had to run and never look back. He packed his camp in a frantic haste, his hands shaking so badly he could barely fasten the straps. But as he turned to flee, he saw something at the top of the stairs. A figure was descending. It was tall and cloaked in what looked like tattered gray rags. He couldn't see a face, only a deep, black void beneath the hood. It did not walk down the stairs. It flowed, a river of shadow pouring itself from one step to the next, and as it descended, it began to whisper his name. Elias Vance. The final entry in the journal is a single terrifying sentence, scrawled so hard it tore through the page. "It's not coming from the stairs. It's coming for me." The journal was found a year later, half buried in mud, miles away from the area Elias was known to be hiking in. Of Elias himself and his expensive camping gear, no trace was ever found. The authorities dismissed the journal as the ravings of a man who had lost his mind to exposure and solitude. But those who have heard the story, who have felt the cold truth in his words, know better. He did not get lost. He was found. Some places in the world are not part of our reality. They are intrusions, glitches in the matrix, places where the code of the universe has been rewritten by an unknown hand. These staircases in the woods, they are a known phenomenon, whispered about by rangers and search and rescue teams. They are anomalies that defy all logic. To encounter one is to stand at a precipice, not of a physical cliff, but of sanity itself. To climb one is to willingly step out of the world you know and into the vast, hungry emptiness that lies between the pages of reality. Elias Vance asked a question, and the universe gave him an answer he could not survive. We have spoken of creatures, of haunted places, of the very woods themselves turning against those who enter. But what if the greatest horror is not something external? What if it is something you bring with you, a darkness that slumbers within your own soul, merely waiting for the isolation and silence of the wilderness to give it permission to awaken? Our final story is not of a monster in the woods, but of the monster within a man. It is a cautionary tale, a cracked mirror held up to the smiling face of civilization, reflecting the skull that lies just beneath the skin. It is the story of a man named David and his solitary camping trip. David was a good man, by all accounts, a loving husband, a devoted father, a respected member of his community. But he carried a pressure inside him, a tightly coiled spring of modern anxieties, frustrations, and repressed anger. He decided to go on a week-long solo camping trip to decompress, to get away from it all. He told his wife it was to find peace, but deep down, in a place he dared not look, he knew he was going to find something else entirely. He was seeking not tranquility, but a release. He chose a spot deep in the back country, a place where he was guaranteed not to see another human soul for days. The first few days were idyllic. He fished, he hiked, he read by the fire. He felt the pressure begin to ease. The silence of the forest was a soothing balm. But as the days wore on, the silence began to change. It was no longer peaceful. It became an amplifier for the thoughts he had been trying to escape. The small resentments, the petty jealousies, the dark, violent impulses he had always kept locked away began to bubble to the surface. The forest was not judging him. It was simply providing a space, a vacuum, for his true nature to expand and fill. He started talking to himself, his voice harsh and angry in the quiet woods. On the fourth night, something broke inside him. A small thing set it off. He was trying to start his fire, but the wood was damp, and it wouldn't catch. His frustration mounted, growing into a disproportionate white-hot rage. He began screaming at the firewood, at the forest, at the silent, watching stars. He took his camp axe, and he didn't just split the wood. He pulverized it, hacking it to splinters, his grunts and screams the only sound for miles. When his rage was spent, he stood panting, his knuckles bloody, the axe handle slick with sweat. He looked at the ruin of his firewood, and he did not feel shame. He felt a terrifying, exhilarating sense of power. The man who went to sleep that night was not the same man who had hiked into these woods. The mask of David, the good husband and father, had cracked. The next day he began to change. He stopped tending to his camp. He let the fire die. He stopped eating. He spent his time stalking through the woods, the axe held loosely in his hand. He was hunting, but not for food. He was hunting for something to unleash his newfound rage upon. He saw a deer, and instead of appreciating its beauty, he felt an urge to see it fall, to see it bleed. The wilderness had not corrupted him. It had simply stripped away the thin veneer of civilization and revealed the predator that had been there all along. He began to create a new camp, a different kind of camp. He used the axe to carve strange, jagged symbols into the trees, symbols he did not understand, but felt compelled to create. He built small, crude effigies from sticks and stones, leaving them as offerings to a god of rage he was only just beginning to know. He was no longer David, the suburban father. He was a primal creature of the wood, a high priest in a temple of his own dark design. It had seen this before. It had seen countless men come into its depths, seeking to escape their world, only to end up escaping themselves instead. When his week was up, he did not pack his things and hike back to his car. The idea of returning to his old life, to the polite smiles and quiet frustrations, was now abhorrent to him. He was free. He stayed. Weeks turned into months. He became a local legend, a ghost story told by other hikers, the wild man of Coulter Pass. They spoke of glimpses of a gaunt, bearded figure moving through the trees, of strange carvings, of a feeling of being watched by hostile human eyes. He was no longer a man. He had become a genius loci, a spirit of the place, a manifestation of the dark potential that lies dormant in the heart of every person. The authorities eventually sent a team to find him. They followed the trail of his madness, the marked trees, the strange, unsettling effigies. They found his original campsite, long abandoned, and then, deeper in the woods, they found his new home. It was a crude shelter built into the base of a cliff, and all around it, on the rocks, on the trees, were messages, written in what they later identified as dried blood. They were not words of madness. They were words of terrifying clarity. One message, repeated over and over, read, "I am finally home." They found David inside the shelter. He was not violent. He was calm, his eyes shining with a strange, dark light. He did not resist. But the man they led out of the woods was only a hollow shell. The real David was gone, left behind in the silent, waiting forest. Do not make the mistake of thinking that the only monsters are the ones with claws and fangs that lurk in the shadows. The most dangerous monster is the one you carry inside your own heart. The wilderness is an immoral space. It does not create evil, but it can be a fertile ground for it to grow. It strips away your distractions, your social contracts, your identity, until you are left alone with the raw, unfiltered truth of what you are. For some, that is a path to enlightenment. For others, it is a path to a creaking door within the soul, a door that once opened can never be closed again. Do you feel this dark message was meant for you? Let your own inner shadows respond below. We have reached the end of our journey through the haunted groves and forgotten trails for tonight. The whispers from the darkness will now recede, returning to the cold ashes and the cracked mirrors from whence they came. But do not be fooled into thinking they are gone. They are always here, waiting in the periphery, in the silence between your heartbeats, in the dark woods of your own mind. The stories you have heard are not meant to simply frighten you. They are meant to change you, to plant a seed of unease, a healthy and necessary fear of the places that lie beyond the streetlights. Remember the couple who were chosen, their love story ending in a single, possessive whisper. Remember the ranger who sought logic and found a god of decay rising from a black lake. Remember the students who were consumed by a forest that grew tired of their disrespect. Remember the ghost hunters who found that some things are not dead but merely waiting. Remember the hiker who climbed a staircase to nowhere, and found the end of everything. And remember the good man who went into the woods to find peace, and instead found the monster he had been hiding his entire life. These are not just tales, they are warnings, written in the universal language of fear. The world is far older, stranger, and more dangerous than your fragile civilized minds can accept. When you next feel the pull of the wild, the urge to sleep under the stars, pause, listen. Listen for the silence that is too loud. Look for the shadows that are too long. Feel for the cold that has no source. The wilderness is not your mother. It is not your sanctuary. It is a vast, living entity with its own rules, its own hungers, and an endless patience. You are a guest in its house, and it is not always welcoming. Every soul that joins this congregation of shadows feeds the voice that whispers from the darkness. Your presence here gives these truths power. Until the next time the crows gather and the mirrors crack, be careful where you wander. The night is long, and it is full of forgotten things.